Announcements. So we have, as part of this series of programs that we're doing, on October 30th, a storytelling event. Now, what's interesting about this is we've been working with a group of young people who are aged 14 to 18 years old who are at the Blackstone Community Center and have been working with them on telling stories about the kinds of things that they wish to change. It's been very eye-opening and heartening to listening to some of the things that young people have to say about their lives and about the kinds of ways that they are living. So I encourage you to come to this event. We've worked with them now. We've had 4 sessions with them in helping to craft their stories and evolve their stories. And then on the 30th, we will have this recital of that, and you'll see some announcements about it. So I encourage you to come back. The second thing, as part of our series, on November 6th, we will have Professor Darity from Duke University, who's going to be here talking about reparations, looking at the issues that have just been identified. So I encourage you to also come back for that as well. And now what I'd like to do is introduce my colleague and my best friend in the whole wide world, and she did double Dutch too, I think, at one time, is Dr. Yvette Cozier. Professor Cozier is our Assistant Dean for Diversity and Inclusion and is the Associate Professor of Epidemiology. Hey, buddy.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yes.
You get a hug.
I get a hug. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Okay.
Thank
there
you.
you go.
Thank you. Yes, Harold is my bestie, and as far as double Dutch, hip replacement ended that, so we're not doing that anymore. Thank you for being here, and I'm really glad that the current topic that I'm about to introduce, education, began to swell up at the end of this last session. So keeping in the theme of the day, the best way to understand our current status in American education, and particularly as it affects African Americans, is to understand the historical events that shaped our status. So just very briefly, slaveholders opposed the education of African Americans and passed laws prohibiting teaching slaves to read or write. And this was in an effort to suppress their agency and also to quell whites' fears of slave rebellions. After emancipation, Black education was relegated to poorly funded, segregated schools. Even in the North, where education was not explicitly prohibited or forbidden, free Blacks were still subjected to restricted curricula and segregated schools, a reality which we still experience in the present. So despite legal intervention, we are not that far beyond the emancipation. So to discuss the legacy of education, including its relationship to current opportunity and health, we have a distinguished panel. So as in the previous session, I will not read their lengthy biographies. I invite you to do that, but I will just introduce them briefly. Sherman James is Professor Emeritus at Duke University, Sanford School of Public Policy. Elmira Mangum is CEO of EMPLUS 3 and a former president of Florida A&M University, my grandmother's alma mater. Linda Greene is the Evjue-Bascom Professor of Law at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Alana Anderson is the Director of Programs in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at Boston University. So at this time, I'd like to invite Dr. James to come forward. Thank you.
Good morning. Well, I too would like to thank the organizers of this really important symposium, and express my thanks for being invited to participate. It's a delight to do so. So I want to use the few minutes that I have to discuss how a consequential education, in combination with some other progressive changes in American society, could help to interrupt the links between systemic racism and perennial African American health disadvantages. I should say that my background is, my former training is in social psychology. I consider myself a social epidemiologist, having taught in schools of public health in departments of epidemiology for 30 years, and I concluded my career at Duke University in the Sanford School of Public Policy. So I kind of have connections to multiple disciplines that that inform what I will share with you this morning. So let's define our terms. If education is the process of imparting or acquiring general knowledge, developing reason and judgment, and preparing oneself or others intellectually for a mature life, then an education that is consequential is one that has great meaning or lasting effect. We know from numerous studies, and this was mentioned in the previous keynote, we know that numerous studies of brain development that the window of greatest opportunity to impart and acquire what I'm calling a consequential education is early childhood through young adulthood. We also know that historical anti-Black racism in the form of laws, policies, and social norms specifically designed to severely limit access by Blacks to a high-quality consequential education has been a key mechanism for reproducing Black poverty across generations. It is also clear that this kind of systemic neglect places Black children who grow up poor at a huge disadvantage relative to other children. Disadvantages that show up in adulthood and, among other things, marked excess death rates for Black Americans from a variety of causes. Excess deaths that could be prevented if systemic neglect were replaced by systemic investment. Studies show that early childhood development interventions for economically disadvantaged Black children can yield impressive ROIs, that is, returns on investment. These include increased IQ and achievement scores, increased college enrollment, less criminal involvement, higher adult incomes, less smoking, fewer risky sexual behaviors, and intriguingly, lower cardiovascular disease risk factors among adults in their mid-30s who had been randomized to receive intensive social and cognitive stimulation when they were between 0 and 5 years of age. Black adults also benefit from when systemic neglect gives way to systemic investments. Within 10 to 15 years after the passage of major civil rights legislation in the mid-1960s, the economic gap between working-age Black and white women narrowed, as did gaps in cardiovascular mortality and life expectancy after age 35. Beginning in the early 1980s, however, the gap widened again, demonstrating, as sociologists Bruce Link and Joe Phelan famously argue, economic or racial elites in a given society will always seek ways to hold on to or restore, if momentarily lost, their advantages over non-elites. And this should be one of the basic tenets of a consequential education, especially for those of us in public health. Namely, systemic racism is resilient. Further, according to Link and Phelan, it is a fundamental cause of racial health inequities because it influences multiple disease outcomes operates through multiple risk factors, determines access to resources, and reproduces health inequities by replacing key intervening mechanisms should some mechanisms lose their potency from one historical period to the next. For Black Americans, historical period 1 might be defined by 250 years of chattel slavery, the key mechanism driving excess Black mortality during that era. In historical period 2, chattel slavery gave way to 100 years of health-damaging Jim Crow laws and customs. And in historical period 3, the present, mass incarceration, voter suppression, and the backlash against affirmative action in higher education are some of the new or refurbished mechanisms. A knowledge of these facts and principles is important, but as Goethe said, knowing is not enough. We must apply. Willing is not enough. We must do. Thank you.
Next is Elmira Mangum.
Good morning. I'm glad it's still morning. I'd like to say that I'm delighted to be here today, and I'm thankful for the BU School of Public Health for having this conversation and on this particular topic now about inequality. But I'd like to share with you some of my experiences and observations from the higher education vantage point, with hopes of inspiring you to decimate this systemic racism in the area of education. The systems of education and schooling are integral in cultivating leaders across this nation and the world. Therefore, they have an indirect responsibility to create a society that serves all of humanity and one that is free of racism. I certainly want to thank the Dean and all the people that helped convene this conference because I think it's timely. Timely because this year, 2019, was declared by the Ghanaian president as the year of return for the African diaspora, inviting Africans across the world to retrace their roots to the point of departure 400 years ago, to commemorate their presence and the sacrifices that they made to the world. This recognition is being supported by the United Nations and countries all over the world with programs hosting them just like this one to have these conversations and dialogues about what can be done, what should be done, and the gaps in the way that people are being treated. Based on its history and more recent events, I think it's fair to say that racism is a public health crisis that has not been adequately addressed. According to the popular definition, a public health crisis generally has a significant impact on community health, loss of life, and on the economy. A crisis may result from disease, industrial processes, or poor policy. As a product of the Jim Crow era, a living witness of the civil rights movement, and a citizen observer, I could comfortably say that racism certainly impacts the community's health, results in loss of life, and impacts the economy. As a social construct, we also know that it informs and influences policy across many sectors, if not all of them, including healthcare, law, religion, labor, politics, war, gender, and entertainment. Among its many purposes, educational institutions are agents of social change and change management and socialization. Schooling is the method used to disseminate governmental and community strategies that prescribe societal behavior and prescriptions and perceptions of people. However, the role of education in breaking systemic and institutional behaviors cannot be fully appreciated without acknowledging how inequality is embraced or practiced within education itself as an industry. The system of inequality is being sustained by racism. In education, it has been a long journey from access, inclusion, and affordability to use quality now of teaching and learning as a culprit causing uninterest and unrest in the educational sector. Although well-intentioned, instead of colorism, more sophisticated strategies, accreditation, performance funding, credit worthiness, and test, along with other outcome metrics, have started to give rise to questions of necessity. This is a point when higher education has never been more important, yet efforts to undermine its reach into all communities continue. I think it was William Shakespeare that said, what's past is prologue in one of his plays. You may recall policy decisions made to open doors, to address quality by eliminating separate but equal with busing, and the creation of many underfunded mandates for special programs. At its origin, the national government's entry into higher education, we find a clear and notable example in the creation of land-grant colleges, the inequity of it all. The Morrill Act in 1862 provided land grants, 59, across the country to states and territories to make higher education available as a public good. You may recall all of the Africans in America were not free until 1866. 24 years later, however, in 1890, the federal government authorized the second Morrill Act and extended funding to the states to make higher education available to the African American with the land grant designation. Today, 17 of the 104 HBCUs have this designation. Now, directly to my focus, these HBCUs were created with a different funding methodology. Land grant, all of them. That is without a gift of 30,000 acres of land for each senator represented in Congress. They only received the $15,000 a year portion that was provided for all land-grant institutions. And so it is today as it was then. Designated funding and special acts of Congress are needed to provide funding for HBCUs and other institutions designated to serve minorities. Today, funding policies and strategies continue to be written to push certain segments of higher education into extinction, while others are encouraged to merge, and still others receive increases in funding to grow capacity. Yet we hear questions and echoes that get louder every day, things that say higher education has lost its value. I attended a conference last year talking about the value of higher education. Why do we need HBCUs or minority-serving institutions? What form or levels of education should we have now? It's well documented that the structure of a capitalist society reproduced the status quo to allow the dominant class to maintain control, and the process of schooling has been held out by the critical scientists as the tool to facilitate advancement of that narrative by blaming those that are unable to negotiate success within the confines of that social structure. Sure, more students need to graduate, ready to work or to create jobs. We also know that it takes resources and more investments to provide the experiences to achieve the increased levels of student success, and also to unravel past plans and practices. Efforts are being made across industry, some with greater levels of success than others. The degrees of success can be tracked closely, however, to resource availability and access to funding. Yet some institutions, HBCUs in particular, are continuously challenged to prove their worth in spite of their success when social investments are normalized and considered. The critics continue to ignore the impact of pre-college experiences in schooling. You see, comparisons are often incomplete. Most don't take into account the lack of investment in pre-K to 12 education into account. except as tools for exclusion by testing. This system of inequality must and can be broken with education and intercultural dialogues that foster quality and allow for personal growth and societal transformation that does not tie self-worth to dominance or oppression. Advances in technology, intercultural dialogue, globalization, and the formation of advocacy groups help to ensure a more immediate response to funding policies as they are being developed. Breaking this cycle is a national problem in search of bold leadership. Leadership that is uncommon, leadership that understands that people are our greatest asset, and leaders that will not scheme to shut down our schools by using lopsided logic to create and maintain policies that uphold programs that provide performance gaps by income, race, and geographic location. Driving change and leadership are difficult in any industry, but as a country, we clearly have experience. After all, we've saved the banking industry and the automobile industry. Most public universities and some privates are facing significant challenges to long-term sustainability due to steadily declining financial support. One only has to look at the policy agendas across the nation to see the increase in political uncertainty and the ambiguity being created over basic needs. As we spend time talking about health care, immigration, and the tax code, the higher education community is scrambling to unravel the consequences and impacts. Conversations about college cost and what type or level of education are increasing in frequency. Capacity and funding discussions are often tracked to and based on birth rates. Perhaps soon we will reach a place where race will not appear on the census form, much like citizenship. Our hope is that we can use this turbulence of the present to build upon and bring closure to past missteps and to reshape society to acknowledge the value and worth of all people. We must redefine the relationships across our communities so that we can live without fear of each other and ensure quality in the educational industry by investing equitably. In summary, as we ask ourselves what is needed to end systemic racism in higher education, we need a change of heart and thinking to enable the well-being and enrichment of opportunities for everyone. Systemic change in education must be addressed at its origin in our socioeconomic and political constructs. History has shown that the elimination of inequity cannot be obtained through or by using isolated efforts, either inside or outside of the established structures. And I'll end with this. You must remember that the God or the power that you believe in came to change your character, not your culture. Thank you.
Professor Linda Greene.
Okay. Changer? Is this it? No? Is this your changer? Okay, just Greene. Okay, great, great. Well, this is a fantastic experience, a great opportunity. I am so pleased to be a part of it. I want to thank Dean Galea and his team for making this possible, and to you for your interest. This is amazing. Maybe the future is bright. I'm going to talk about education and equality under the Constitution, and, okay, no, not really. Sorry, I apologize. Which one are we pressing? Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, so I want to start with just some key dates. I think we all know these dates. 1619, Jamestown. 1776, the Declaration of Independence. 1789, the 1789 Constitution. 1865, the end of the Civil War, and also the 13th Amendment. 1876, the end of Reconstruction. That was 11 years. And then redemption. 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal is constitutional. And that was in the area of public transportation. In 1899, the Supreme Court extended Plessy's principles to education and sanctioned a school board not only maintaining segregated schools, but also deciding to offer only elementary education to blacks while educating whites through high school. The Supreme Court said that that was consistent with the 14th Amendment. We often don't think very much about what happened before Brown versus Board of Education, but before Brown versus Board of Education, certain architects of full citizenship decided that they would focus on the desegregation of higher education. Charles Hamilton Houston, his pupil was Thurgood Marshall, and they assembled a team of people to take Plessy on, head on. Their strategy was this, that if state university systems do not provide higher education programs in certain fields, a priori, they would violate Plessy versus Ferguson. And so they took on those states where the state maintained law schools for whites, but provided no legal education for blacks. They started in Maryland and won that case because the University of Maryland maintained a law school that was white only, and their state court struck that down as a violation of Plessy. You can't have separate but equal if there is no opportunity. They moved from there to the University of Missouri, which also maintained an all-white state school and no school for blacks. The Supreme Court said that the practice was unconstitutional, but when Missouri returned to the lower courts, they decided to start a black law school at a historically black state school. They gave it almost no funding, and for over 30 years, the University of Missouri excluded blacks from their law school. Their strategy was this: wait until Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston sue. When the court orders us to open that school, establish a black state law school, provide a couple of professors and a few books, and tell the court that that is equality. So that is how Missouri proceeded after the Supreme Court decision. Other states pursued the Missouri strategy. They waited until Marshall and Houston sued them, and then after they lost, they established a small black law school at a separate university. Eventually, the Supreme Court began to understand, and so in 1948, Ida Sipil sued Oklahoma, and she was successful in the Supreme Court. Oklahoma tried the same strategy, but finally, the lawyers were able to let the Supreme Court know that this was not equality. In 1948, however, the southern states saw the handwriting on the wall, and they came together to form a regional compact. And their idea was that they would provide for equal education by establishing segregated professional schools that they hoped the Supreme Court would bless as equal. In 1950, the Supreme Court held that Oklahoma could not exclude blacks from its education, higher education, and graduate education programs. Same strategy. They waited until the lawyers sued. The court said that the policy of segregation and exclusion was unconstitutional. They did admit Mr. McLaurin, but they forced him to sit outside the classroom, they forced him to eat at a separate table, and they forced him to study at a separate table in the library. The Supreme Court said this is not equality. It is not enough to admit a person to a school. They must have the opportunity to interact with other students. Otherwise, their education will not be equal to those of others. Sweat versus Painter, same strategy in Texas. Marshall and Houston won, and then Texas established a separate law school. The Supreme Court, of course, by now had learned a lot about these strategies, and the Supreme Court said that that policy of establishing a poorly funded law school and then coming back to court to say that that was equality under Plessy was not satisfactory. And along the way, in both the McLaurin case in Oklahoma and also in the Texas case, the court began to talk about what constitutes a quality education, that it was more than tangible material equality, but it was the opportunity to interact with classmates, to get to know future colleagues. And this is one part of the story that leads to Brown versus Board of Education. The court decides Brown versus Board in 1954, banning segregation in K through 12. It says segregation is unconstitutional because it impairs effective learning, promotes feeling of inferiority, and limits the opportunity to fully participate in American society. And the court not only built, of course, and relied on the research of the Clarks, but also on the statements it had made in those earlier higher education cases. However, the next year, the court decided what remedies it ought to provide for school segregation, and it punted here. It said that school districts should make a prompt and reasonable start, but in the year between Brown 1 and Brown 2, the states had developed many rationales for delaying desegregation, and in that Supreme Court decision, the Supreme Court blessed them all, and that is what those school districts did. It was not until 1971 that the Supreme Court issued a decision that ordered busing and demanded that district courts measure the progress towards integration. However, just 3 years later, the court began to decide cases in which it limited the remedies for unconstitutional segregation along two lines. One, it limited the ability of courts to merge schools and bring schools together. That's the desegregation aspect. But it also limited the requirement that resources be provided in order to make up for decades and decades of unequal education. 74 to 1992. In 2007, the Supreme Court struck down voluntary desegregation efforts. And so we have a two-part message from the Supreme Court. Not only are courts not to play an aggressive role in undoing segregation or in providing the resources to make up and compensate for decades and decades of unequal education, centuries of unequal education, also no power to bring people together, young people together, without proof of intentional discrimination. So that's the story at the K through 12 level. How about desegregating higher education after Brown? In 1962, the court ordered James Meredith be admitted to the University of Mississippi, and his is only one of many stories of court-ordered desegregation of Southern schools. That discussion goes on. 1992, the court ordered the desegregation of the University of Mississippi system. And I point this out to say that this question of desegregation and unequal resourcing of historically black state institutions is not a thing of the past. Courts are still dealing with these issues, and litigants and institutions are still fighting out these battles in the courts. Lest you think that 1992, that case continues on. Very recently, 2019, a federal district court judge in Maryland continues to oversee the possible settlement of a case in which the historically black state institutions in Maryland and students in Maryland have argued that not only has Maryland continued to adopt policies that maintain racial segregation in the schools, they have deliberately underfunded the state historically black colleges in the state, in the system. And so this case will be going on probably until 2030. I have no doubt about it. But I want to emphasize the contemporary nature of these issues. As to voluntary desegregation, I refuse to call it by its other name. The court did say in 1978 that voluntary desegregation efforts could be constitutional. It did strike down the program of the University of California, Davis Medical School in a very confusing decision, but it did leave open the possibility that states could voluntarily desegregate their higher education systems. The court did not get back to it again until 2003, in which it held that voluntary desegregation of higher education was constitutional. Courts would subject it to a very high and stringent standard of review, and that imposes a great deal of legal risk should a university decide to undertake such a program. But at least the message of Grutter is that higher education institutions may undertake this work. The court reaffirmed that holding in 2013 in what we call Fisher versus University of Texas 1. And then it also reaffirmed the holding of Grutter in 2016, saying that voluntary desegregation of higher education is constitutional, but one of the messages of the case is that a university system that decides to pursue this will have to be willing to invest millions of dollars in the defense of the programs. Texas invested millions of dollars, University of Michigan and Grutter over $20 million to defend the program. Fisher did say that student body diversity is a compelling state interest that can justify the use of race in university admissions, but that race should only be used when necessary, that the institution had to prove that there were no workable alternatives, and ensure that each individual is evaluated on his or her merits. And then in 2014, the Supreme Court said that a state could adopt a ban on voluntary desegregation of their higher education institutions, and that would be consistent with the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. I want to say one thing before I'm closing, and that is, you note that there are two strands in the discussion of desegregation of education, whether it is the desegregation of K through 12 or the desegregation of higher education. One strand involves litigation to prove that a system actually employed race deliberately in order to practice exclusion. So that's one strand. And the court has set a very, very high standard for proving intentional racial discrimination generally, but also for proving intentional racial discrimination in the context of higher education. And so very, very high standard, high bar, very difficult to prove. Millions of dollars must be spent in order to make that case. If you can make that case, then it is possible to get courts to order relief. On the other side, we have the possibility of voluntary desegregation, either at the higher education level or K through 12. And here, the court has imposed standards that make it very risky from a legal point of view to undertake a voluntary program. So if I can say so again, the standard for proving intentional segregation is very high and difficult to meet. And the standard for justifying voluntary segregation is also very high and difficult to meet. And so what the court has done is created a vise in which millions of dollars of resources must be allocated in order to prove race as an intentional factor, and also millions of dollars of resources must be allocated in order to justify voluntary desegregation programs. It won't surprise you that very few institutions that have a track record of very few minorities or blacks at their higher education institutions are going to raise their hand and say, yes, we engage in intentional racial discrimination, Your Honor, and therefore we want to fix it. I say that because it explains the reason why we talk about diversity as a compelling interest in our discussions of the desegregation of higher education outside of Mississippi, outside of Maryland, and not that decades and in some cases century-long history of exclusion. We don't want to talk about the elephant in the room, but we're happy to talk merely about diversity. I want to end. We don't want to talk about equity, to use the language. We don't want to talk about equity. We don't want to talk about inclusion. We want to talk about diversity. And by saying that, I'm not saying that diversity, the opportunity to enjoy the talents of people of all backgrounds and to have those people contribute, all people of all backgrounds and all experiences contribute to our institutions so that they can truly flourish in the way that Scott Page talks about institutions flourishing when they are able to take advantage of the cognitive experiences of people with different backgrounds. I want to say that is extremely important. But equity, fairness, legality, that is also important. And without a focus on our fault, we leave those who come to our institutions in an extremely precarious position in terms of the legitimacy of their presence and also in terms of the legitimacy of their absence. So let me conclude by saying, and I want here to say something about desegregation as an end in itself versus desegregation as a means of accessing resources as well as a way to provide a community in which our country can go forward and flourish. To be sure, an end to racial isolation is a worthy substantive and symbolic goal, grounded in a vision of a working society in which children coming to share in a common goal of worth and connectedness and in inclusion. Partisans who question the possibility of integration will choose litigation or policymaking to advance their limited vision of Brown. However, for many, including those who oversee and deliver educational services, often in hyper-segregated communities, the clamor is not for the nostalgia of racial desegregation, but for structural reforms in schools and communities that will support educational outcomes consistent with the full occupational and political participation in an increasingly diverse and global America. The Census Bureau's prediction that the Hispanic and Asian populations would more than double by 2050 is on track to fulfillment. And our school districts at the intersection of race, language, class, and criminal supervision complicate our analysis of disparate educational achievement, rendering race alone an imprecise lens through which to focus on educational equality. It is the task of a new team of interdisciplinarians, much like the one Houston and Marshall assembled to craft a post-Plessy vision of equality, to create a Brown-grounded narrative of intersectional equality that demands constitutional recognition and constitutionally sheltered correction. This is no embrace of a post-racial narrative. Rather, it is a call to examine anew the relationship between school decisions and societal circumstances that create or exacerbate negative educational outcomes and cripple too many children in their competition for a role in a new technological and global world.
Brown is much like the flag that once flew over embattled Fort McHenry, made famous by Francis Scott Key. That flag is much too valuable to discard, and it is conserved, restored, and cherished because of its symbolic force that shelters a nation. Like that flag, Brown, too, must shelter a more diverse, complex, and non-dichotomous nation. We must theoretically reweave the constitutional fabric so that it is strong enough to support a new educational vision for the 22nd century and beyond. Thank you. Thank you.
And Alana Anderson.
Thank you. Good morning. I am delighted to be here and humbled to be a part of this panel. My talk is going to be around higher education, but specifically around activism. My background is student-centered, and in my own college experience, I experienced some activism as well. So this is a topic that is really near and dear to my heart. So many of America's revered colleges and universities were soaked in the sweat, tears, and blood of Black people. These institutions have historical relationships with slavery and enslaved people as the slave economy and higher education grew up together, each nurturing each other. Slavery funded colleges, built campuses, and paid the wages of professors, and academic leaders aggressively courted the support of slave owners and slave traders. Today, these colleges and universities have campus buildings named after racist slave-owning people, slavery-complicit men and women, and are environments full of racial politics with traditions of racist parties and overall hostile spaces for Black students. These students encounter a collegiate environment that is often dismissive of racial inappropriate or insensitive comments and practices by students, faculty, and staff. Amid these experiences and other historically, and still today, students utilize activism as a mechanism to showcase their opposition to racism, sexism, classism, and other structural inequities rooted in the higher education system. Throughout history, students have been major change agents both on and off campus, college campuses. In 1960, 4 African-American freshmen at North Carolina A&T, whose nonviolent protest of segregation by sitting at a whites-only lunch counter in Greensboro sparked widespread student involvement in the civil rights movement. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, formed later that year and soon had active members at college campuses across the country. In the late 1960s, we see students speaking up about the Vietnam War, the free speech movement, and feminism, to name a few issues. And we also saw activism move the needle within higher education to create Chicano and Latina studies departments in Florida and ethnic studies departments across the country. Today, we have what many call the most forceful surge of youth activism since the 1960s. Our college students have sought to drive social change in America, and college campuses have been places where social issues are being raised. From the hunger strike, encampment, and football team boycott demanding the ouster of the University of Missouri's president, to a New York University student dragging a mattress to class for an entire year in protest of sexual violence, to marches against visiting supporters of President Donald Trump, to die-ins for racial justice, unrest spreads among college students. In 2016, an annual UCLA survey of undergraduates nationwide found that 1 in 10 students expected to participate in protests while in college, the highest rate since 1967. When we further examine many of the demands submitted by students in much of the recent college activism, they have included increases in the admission and retention of students of color, particularly Black identified students, while also calling for the systemic changes, including critical examinations of course curriculum, as well as audits and adjustments of spaces where hierarchical racist paradigms exist within each institution. Power as manifested in higher education institutions is an extension of white supremacist capitalism produced by a formula for redefining and perfecting its practice of exclusion and regulation. In my experience, the activism of students is viewed by many administrators on campuses as scary and disruptive. Schools worry about their public relations image rather than the concerns that students are seeking recourse from. And ultimately, much of this renewed activism reminds us that our higher education institutions have not seriously engaged in disrupting the racist status quo. Doing so requires acknowledgement of and space for envisioning a campus where students of color, particularly Black students, are valued and all are educated about the realities of race and racism. Higher education's unjust systemic devaluing of people of color contributes to a dominant narrative in which stereotypes are propagated with no recourse or remedy. An overwhelming majority of faculty members in our higher education landscape are white. They comprise the majority of full professors, endowed chairs, and college and university presidents and trustees. White men are the primary beneficiaries of leadership positions in most post-secondary institutions, with the exception of historically Black institutions and some minority-serving institutions. Through practice, we're seeing that institutions suppress the voices of the racially marginalized groups and provide ample space for negative racist campus climates. Power Freire suggests that oppression is best understood through the voices of those who experience it, and through the activism that we see college students engaging in, they are begging for more seats at the table to open up for people of color. So it's important that we do that while also recognizing that the higher education system and those that benefit from it, white people, must be open to recognizing the entrenchment of race and racism and oppression and working to incorporate a critical race perspective into the daily practice of their work. It can also be argued, and it's important to note, that students of color, particularly Black students, time and energy are disproportionately used to mitigate their experiences with anti-Blackness and white supremacy through various forms of oppositional campus involvement at times. We must acknowledge the labor required for activism and understand the invisible tax these take up, which can lead to feelings of emotional and physical fatigue. Coping with microaggressions forces students to spend their energy and personal resources constantly resisting mundane racism, which distracts them from important, creative, and productive areas of life. The consistent coping leads to this racial battle fatigue that we talk about, this result of constant physiological, cultural, and emotional coping with racial microaggressions in less than ideal and racially hostile or unsupportive environments. Relying on students of color and Black students to organize and to educate their white peers about racism is a form of racism itself. And it contributes to an ongoing sense of racial battle fatigue. Higher education scholar Dr. Lori Patton argues that little change will occur in the functioning of higher education given the stagnant nature of leadership, policies, racial climate, curriculum, and culture, which are deeply rooted in whiteness. And she argues that students are educated in white supremacy as they pursue higher education. She states it's entirely possible for students to graduate from college without critically reflecting on their racist views, never having engaged in meaningful conversations about race, using racially offensive language unknowingly, and oftentimes educators are responsible for letting students and ourselves off the hook rather than engaging the conversation and the necessary subsequent action. We should be empowering our students to understand the importance of being agents of change. And one mechanism through which we can do this is through activism. But we as higher education educators and professionals must take a long look in the mirror about the taxes and the labor that we place on students, particularly our Black students, when we fail to examine and dismantle the system of repression which exists in our departments and our institutions. We seek to help our students gain a critical eye of the world and examine and uncover its needs and pain in order to do so, to make lasting work and change in the areas that they seek to go into. But we must teach students to be activists and change agents and work with us, not in spite of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for those comments. I know that there are a lot of questions, so I'm going to be very brief here. Can turn this over to the audience. But it is, there are many observations. It's one, that it's impossible to speak about education without coming back to this issue of segregation. And it's impossible to think about that without going back to our previous panel, which would be housing. So I think to try to bring together all of your varied comments, I'm going to take something out of Dr. Brooks's remarks earlier, and I'm going to ask this general question. What are the moral aspirations that we need to make the educational system equitable? And within that question, who are the moral architects for making this system equitable?
Hi. I think students are a part of it, but I don't think we should put all of the work on students. And I think what sort of, at least what I see in the higher education landscape sometimes is we just wait until the students sort of push us to do the work rather than examining and unpacking what's happening through surveys and through conversations and believing people when they say that they've experienced microaggressions and racism and not making them have to re-experience them over and over for us to believe them. So I think that students are a really unique and important part of that in sort of creating the landscape that we want to envision and sort of work within. But I also think it's, I'll again speak from the higher education landscape, I think it's imperative that we look to research. I know that there was a lot of talk in the earlier panels about the importance of research, and I think that we need to start taking that research off of the shelf and really sort of unpacking and figuring out ways that we can use it in our day-to-day work and our practice. So.
I look at it, I won't answer the moral question, but I think that boards of trustees and boards of regents have to decide that they want a leader who has the moral and transformational competency to actually take an institution, unpack its history, that structural history of exclusion that is a part and product of many of our institutions, and then to have a leader, to give power to a leader, whether that it's a chair or a president or a provost, power to a leader to undertake the work with the power of the institution undergirding it. And so I think it is a question of leadership. Many important changes have occurred in higher education because of student activism. Many important changes have occurred in our country as a result of student activism, not solely, but certainly importantly. At the same time, higher education leadership of a particular nature with a moral vision for a just society, I think, is necessary, maybe insufficient, but it's a necessary condition to the transformation of our institutions.
Thank you. May I? Yes. I'm toiled with the moral piece because I think it's everyone's responsibility. The moral aspirations, if we go back to the Constitution and the preamble and all of that, where it says all people are created equal. If we begin to think that all people are created equal and treat everyone equally, it should spread itself throughout our society. But I think leadership at the national level is extremely important. We look at top-down leadership. People take their cues from the people above them. But we know that the major revolutions and change in this country has come from the bottom. It comes bottom up. So we need all of it. Everyone needs to participate.
Thank you.
Well, I certainly agree with all of the previous comments. Change within the institutions of higher education is really a very, very difficult thing to bring about. And when it does happen, it happens because of the kind of student activism about which we have just heard so much and expressed so eloquently. Professors of color, particularly African American professors and increasingly Latino professors, are significantly underrepresented in institutions of higher education, particularly the most prestigious. It is very rare to find an African American in a position of real power, regardless of the educational credentials that that person might bring to bear on a candidacy for a position of real power. Many subjective considerations enter into who gets the actual offer. And a lot of the considerations go on behind closed doors, a lot of politicking by people with real power. And so it's very difficult then to actually achieve the kind of effective leadership in top-level positions, particularly at the most prestigious universities, that would be necessary to bring about the kind of transformational change occurring, within institutions. I'm reminded of a statement attributed to President Lyndon Johnson when he set about to create what he called the Great Society. And he said upon becoming president, what's the point in having power if you're not going to use it? And he used it. Now, he had a lot of flaws, but he cajoled people, he twisted arms, and he exercised power that was crucial to bringing about some of the changes that I actually showed on the slide in terms of the 1965 to 1980 improvements in the health of black Southerners. And it was important that LBJ was himself a Southerner because he had an insider sort of point of view on the kind of oppression and what it looked like on the ground. So anyway, I just want to say that at the end of the day, it really is about power. And it's important to understand, I think, that when you have professors of color basically concentrated in lower academic ranks at major universities, and it's very difficult to rise up through the ranks unless you sort of toe the line with respect to certain things. Because a lot of subjective considerations enter into whether or not you're going to get tenure, whether or not you're going to actually get a department chairmanship, whether you're actually going to become a dean or a provost. And so it's important just to realize what those realities are on the ground, which is why for the most part we see student activism putting pressure on departments, putting pressure on universities, to bring about some changes, albeit around the margins in more cases than not.
So I want to make sure that we get to some of the questions and voices here. So I know this side of the room has not had a lot of love in previous times. Come on, grab her.
Hi, thank you all very much for your work and for being here with us today. I really appreciate everything you all had to say. I am an alumna of Boston University and a current nurse practitioner student at Northeastern University. And I wanted to kind of start by saying I see myself as someone who is has integrated and continues to integrate these universities. So thank you for pointing to the fact that it's an ongoing process. I feel really frazzled right now. So thanks for your patience with me. Thank you. So one of the things that I've been thinking about through this entire day has been how can we make academia and education more useful to Black people? So I think about like retention and how part of it has to do with these structural barriers, but part of it has to do with we come into these sorts of spaces and we're not challenged. We're rehashing theory that's actually really basic to us. So I know like a lot of people who are here, even as professors, like I'm sitting here, I'm listening to your presentations and I'm like, I wonder what the scope of their vision really is. And I wonder when I as a student will actually be able to be exposed to that. Because I know that because of the constraints put on us by like predominantly white institutions, that what we end up presenting is so limited, you know, and is so basic to those of us who come from Black communities. Like I am bored. I'm serious, and it's scary. It's scary because there's a lot of work to be done. So I guess a question that I have for everyone sitting on the panel, is how do you deal with being in a situation where so often the work that you're allowed to do, the work that you're empowered to do, is such a limited fraction of what your vision is for your community and what our community's visions are for ourselves? How do you cope with that personally? And also, how do we make academia and education more useful to Black people so that if and when we leave these institutions, our experience can actually extend into into embodying and bringing and manifesting these visions that we have, instead of just being like this traumatic experience that we had and then that we have to recover from, should we ever decide to move out of academia. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I don't think there could be a fully all-embracing answer to your question, but I'm just think of myself as a student. I was a student once, and I always had two educational programs. I had the one that I had to undertake in order to graduate, and then I created a program for myself, which involved seeking out people who could help me understand my weaknesses as well as my strengths, and seeking out people or courses or experiences that pose challenges to me, going in the direction of my fears and my anxieties in order to take the responsibility to glean from my environment the kind of all-encompassing education that met my needs. So I'm not saying this as an excuse for an institution, but I had a strategic plan for my own education, and it did involve reaching out not only more effectively to people in my university environment, people you might assume that they're professors who don't want to talk to you, but you might be surprised if you really expand yourself that there are people who would take you on. So that's one. And then second, asking the question, what is my strategic vision for my education? What do I want to do or achieve? And then consult with people on what should a all-encompassing educational strategy and experiential strategy be to achieve your objectives. So I just can say from my own experience that was extremely useful to me and led to some really fantastic experiences, not only during school, but also thereafter.
I would add to that, first of all, we all had the same experience that you're having. It's unfortunate that you're still having it now. But I would say that one of the things that we were advised to do was do the research. If you do the research, then there will be information in the literature for people like you to follow and to study. And it can also inform your colleagues in your community about your experiences and what's happening in the Black community. Secondly, I would say, institutions need to hire more people that look like you. They can help you navigate the data, the information that you're receiving in the classroom from an experienced point of view, as in they have experienced the same things that you're experiencing, and they can direct you probably more appropriately, or I will say will have more knowledge about what you're experiencing and going through. So it's part of the process of education that you need to have a plan. Like she said, I mean, we grew up in a planning era. I had a strategic plan. I had a life plan. I knew what I was going to do, what year, when I was going to buy a car, and all of that. You need to think about that in terms of education and have a plan.
Sounds like a certain candidate, right?
Yeah, let me just add. Yeah,
Maybe you're going to get in, right?
yeah, let me add the importance of. I'm going to speak about African American faculty, but I suspect it generalizes to other groups of color. It's important for African American faculty members to have African American students. I mean, that is hugely important. I want to emphasize how much energy that gives to a black professor who, in many instances, is isolated, is intellectually isolated, socially isolated in a particular environment, which means, you know, getting tenure, moving up the ranks becomes very important because it's all about collaboration. It's all about relationships, right? So having black students, if you're a black professor, or having other kinds of students who understand enough about, you know, the African American experience that they can really bring something to the table when you want to do research involving African Americans. And because I'm a public health person, I mean research in black communities with black communities, with people who understand the dynamics, the history of those communities, and from whom we can learn. So getting out into the community, ideally with funded research so that you can actually support, you can pay your students so they can get hands-on experience, they can learn how you do research, how you interact with communities, how you learn from communities, and how you relate to them in a respectful way. All of that is really very empowering. And it's a win-win situation for all of the actors involved. And I think that that's the recipe for success. I think the reason why I was able to stay in academia at some of the universities where I've taught for as long as I did and survive was because I was able to create in time that kind of model.
So we want to get to one more question, but I want to chat with you after because I have thoughts too.
When 78% of white Harvard students and only 18% of Afro-Americans would not be admitted to the freshman class of Harvard based on legacy, donors, and athletics. We have a major problem in entrenched institutions like Harvard and elite schools. And it's based on the fact of the influence of money, as you alluded to. I don't know how this can be changed, but this is a study that came out last month regarding the issue of Asian Americans. And it's an indictment of the universities, as I see it, because this has to end. We cannot continue to have this elite legacy donors being given privilege at institutions across the country. Thank you.
Only thing I'll say to that is donor money could be used to diversify and provide equity to an institution. So we need money to sort of fix some of these problems. So we got to fix that, but we also need money.
So I think I can do one more, or one more. Okay. Raul, I'm sorry, but I've got to. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, my goodness.
Oh, hold on, there's a mic.
Yeah, I got you, sis. It's all good. First of all, thank you for your life and your work. You're a blessing to the world and to this room. I appreciate even being in the whole space with you, all of you. My question as an activist and as someone who is paid and asked to come into institutions and organizations and do racial equity trainings, mine is definitely about solutions, but I think they've been raised a couple of times in this room. So as an activist and all the realities that I embody, I grow tired of working through things like tone policing or people's comfortability with issues, because to me that really is what stops my work, when somebody has the privilege and the power to speak to, I'm uncomfortable with you using the word racism. When you guys come in, can you talk about general diversity? So I'm hearing all of these solutions and thought taking, and I also want to ask why now, when all of these hot button issues, the biggest intervention is dialogues, because it feels comfortable. And that's no shot, it's just facts. So when people become uncomfortable just talking about the issue, now, like my brother right here just said, when we're talking about losing your job, taking a step back so somebody else can get a shot, like my family right here, that's when it gets real, and that's uncomfortable. Because now we've all grown up in the same system and we're all complicit. So how do we unpack people's fragility around being uncomfortable and the politeness protocols that go along in society and definitely in academia when it comes around these issues? But as a teacher of middle school kids who smell the best and do the most, just keeping it real on this mic, how can we focus more on turning students into collaborators as opposed to consumers?
Okay, I'll take a stab. One of the things in the work that I do specifically here at BU that we talk a lot about is how do we build capacity? And I think that part of your question is sort of how do we help people build the capacity to lean into discomfort and be okay with that, and be okay and wrestling with what that discomfort means and how it affects others. Right, okay, me too. I think that there are a lot of ways to do it. I think one of the ways that I am a big proponent of are in-group dialogue. So white people have to collect white people, right? Like you have to sort of work together and lean into having dialogue within a group in order to maybe sort of push and challenge each other and each other's understanding. So I think a part of it is that we all have to, as different identities, take on sort of the collective responsibility to do the work of equity and inclusion and not just leave it to those that are the other or those that stand to gain from it. So I think that that's a really important part of it. I think it's also for those that are in the choir per se, which I would imagine are all of us, to recognize that there are levels and stages to this work. And I think that because I've done this work for so many years, I sometimes get very frustrated about someone's lack of understanding, recognizing that I'm at 505 and they're barely at 101, right? And so I think that it's also important in this work, we recognize that everybody's coming into it at a different level, at a different age, at a different stage. And that's not to belittle their experience, but that's to say, I need you to move along with me, and maybe it's a slower pace that we're going, but you have to move. And I think it's also sort of, as the millennial on the panel, I think that there are things to it related to social media and sort of how we consume media and knowledge that we're also trying to work against. If people go onto different platforms and read a title of an article and then believe that, right? We're also working against sort of the understanding and notion of what is actual knowledge. So it's complicated, but I think doing things like this and sort of naming the issue is a big step in the process.
Let me just say one thing. I would encourage you to continue to have that dialogue. People need to know who you are, know how you feel, and know how what they do and what they say makes you feel. They aren't going to know it by observing you. You're going to have to, I'm sorry, you're just going to have to keep telling them. It takes time for things to change, for years and years and years, and then it'll move back and it'll go forward and then it'll move back. But you cannot give up. So the resilience that was being talked about earlier is extremely important. We fought for a very long time just to sit here, to talk about it some more, and we'll keep talking about it until we change it. And people get it. They have to hear us.
So I want to thank our panel. I want to thank the audience, and we will we'll continue on. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, nice job there. There you go. Thanks. Thank you very much to this panel. And certainly this idea of leaning into discomfort is incredibly an important thing for us to think about. I want to tell you what's going to happen next. So after lunch, Sister Modesta Jones will be here, and we begin to think about, so where to from here, as we think about where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. So I encourage you to be part of that conversation as we think about, so what are some of the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about as we go beyond this point. I want to introduce to you now, however, someone who is the real reason that we are all here, Dr. Robert Fullilove. So Bob Fullilove, actually, along with Professor Mindy Fullilove, had this idea that we should commemorate this 400 years of inequality, this 400 years of slavery occurring in this country. And Bob talked with Sandro, and then Sandro talked to me. But Bob has also talked to people across the country. And because of the work that he's done, there are now more than 100 other programs that are happening similar to this one. Bob is from Columbia University, another one of those places that we don't say in this room, but you know, it's all right for right now. Bob is the Associate Dean for Community and Minority Affairs. He's the Professor of Clinical Socio-Medical Sciences and the co-director of the city's research group. And the best thing that Bob told me was that we have outdone what Columbia was doing concerning this program. The thing that I want you to know about Bob is that he is active, he is an advocate, he is a thought leader, he is smart, he is engaged, and he is here with Bob.
Good afternoon, everyone. And for Dean Galea, thank you so much. This is really spectacular. Professor Cox, you didn't have to say in public that you're outdoing Columbia. I got to go home. I will be quoted on this, I know. I think it's important for me to point out that much of this began when Mindy Fullilove started to write a book that will be published in the spring called Main Street. She has written extensively about displacement, and as a psychiatrist, she's very concerned about the psychology of place and how little we understand the manner in which who we are, and what we do is often conditioned by the places where we find ourselves. In thinking about the history of displacement of African American populations, a key point she wants to make in her book, Main Street, she started thinking in 2016 about what's the original displacement that gives rise to so much of what we have talked about today. And it became clear 2019 was going to be 400 years since the first significant displacement created so much of what we are struggling with today. Part of what she wanted to point out was that this is not just a history that was visited upon African Americans. In choosing the title 400 Years of Inequality, she wanted to point out, as much as it was possible, something of the cognitive dissonance that occurs when you look at the language of the Constitution of the United States. It says all people are created equal, but 3 articles of the Constitution, as many of you know, enshrine slavery as part of what founded this nation. That's the cognitive dissonance. All men are created equal on the one hand, and oh yeah, we're going to have slaves on the other. She started to argue that this isn't just what impacted folk of color. This impacts immigrants, women, members of the LGBTQ community, and on and on and on. Now, it's not that inequalities don't exist worldwide. Of course they do. But to have them exist in the framework and in the structure of a democratically conceived republic, that, she said, is an issue. And this is the moment when we should be starting to talk about it. But it's also the case, and I'm speaking especially to the professors and the teachers in the audience, isn't it clear how little we know history? How many of you who have been lecturing in the classroom and suddenly discover that when you mention a name like Richard Nixon, your students have no idea who you're talking about? Can I get an amen? All righty. And it's not the fault of the students. As a nation, we have been really deliberate about making sure that we're about math and science, that higher education is about getting a job. It's no longer about giving you a sense of the world, your place in it, and a sense of what you must do with that place once you have it. No, the moment we forgot history, it became clear that the current tenant of the White House is able to say outrageous things, content in the knowledge that no one really understands the significance of what he has said, what he has urged, what he's condemned almost all of us to live with. I think it's also the case, too, that in many of the presentations that I've heard throughout the United States in our effort to get 400 years of inequality initiatives going, we often present a litany of bad news. So much of what we hear today has to do with how horrible it is to think about the manner in which inequalities have devastated the health of African Americans and other communities of color. I worry about what happens when we have a litany of bad news, because at some levels, it makes us think of the folk who've been the recipient of the bad news, the folks who've been ruined, disenfranchised, rendered unequal by these kinds of policies. We tend to think of them as victims. And victims are largely folk that we think deserve our charity. What I think you've heard many folks say today, however, is that it's not enough to simply understand the plight of the folk who've been disadvantaged. What's missing from so much of our conversation is the idea of agency. What is it that folk who are in these communities should be expected to do to fight for their own rights? Which is why I so appreciated the conversation about activism. I think some of you may know that I'm an old guy. I was born in 1944. That means in January I'm going to be 76 years old. That, by the way, is a shameless plea for applause. You're all going to come up and say, dude, you look really good for a guy that old. But I was privileged in 1964 to be an intern in the offices of Dr. Martin Luther King. I met Julian Bond in 1964 in Atlanta, and I became part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. You heard someone make reference to that. I was a SNCC field secretary for 4 years. I wasn't just around in Mississippi in 1964. I was around in 65 and 66. I was part, unfortunately, of the riot that occurred in Newark, New Jersey in 1967. And I think, in the spirit of full disclosure, that of all the things that conditioned my thinking about how we regard an event like today, the idea that activism and agency is part of what we have to have as our agenda is really in the forefront of all my thoughts as I think about how we're going to conclude this session. It's also something that I've learned to do as part of my teaching in prison. In the description of my bio that appears in the program, you'll see that I've been teaching in 6 prisons in upstate New York for 10 years now. I'm part of the Barred Prison Initiative, and if I may make a plug for them, in November, I believe November 25th, Ken Burns has produced a documentary called College Behind Bars. I strongly encourage you to have a look at what you see there, because the 10 years I've been teaching in BPI has been an opportunity to bring the message of public health and courses in public health to folk that I've taught in these institutions. There are currently 4 graduates of Columbia University who were trained in prison by the Barred Prison Initiative. 3 of them have master's degrees in public health from Columbia. They all work for the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. And when I think about activism, I think about the approach that I've taken to them, because I say, this is not unlike what it was to do organizing in the SIP in the 1960s. Because, gentlemen, ladies, If you're able to follow a Columbia University professor in prison, if you can understand what I say about epidemiology, standardized mortality ratios, then be clear your real role isn't just to be a student here. When you return home, there's work to do. I can't tell you what it's like in an era of jaded students to be in a place where my students challenge me. They're not simply listening politely to what I have to say. Whatever struggles we may have about the notion that many of our students think of themselves as imposters, where we worry about imposter syndromes, it's refreshing to be in a place where people can't wait to have their opportunity to do public health work in their communities. In my classes, I ask people to write a final proposal where they're going to tell me, what will you do when you go back home? What will be the nature of your struggle when you're in your community? And understand, because my students are Black, white, Hispanic, and Asian, this is not so much about race as it is what it means to return home and do the work. I am, at age 75, hugely inspired by them, because as we talk about activism, as we talk about what it means to understand the lessons of history, I think it becomes clear. We have work to do. We have work to do. Let today be the beginning of that work. If you've had, as a result of listening to the presentations today, a sense that it's all hopeless, that, oh my God, look at what the last 400 years have brought, think about the future. Think about the future. We have work to do. And when you confront students, when you return to your communities, when you just think about what am I going to do next, keep that refrain in mind. We have work to do, because we do. Thank you.
Exactly. Grab a box lunch. We'll see you in 30 minutes.